Yeah, Sudarshan, I think you can start.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Continue.
All right. Where is it? One sec. Yeah, good evening, all of you. I'm Sudarshan Ramesh, current final year in mechanical engineering, and here to explain to you guys about how to do the guesstimates. All right. So that's who I am. All right. Thanks a ton for coming and actually giving us some of your time. Now, we understand that over the past few years, consulting jobs have become more and more common. And I'm guessing many of you here are interested in the profile and are hoping to get a basic idea on how to start. All right. So, here we at Big Data and Analytics Club and Consulting Cell have decided to host a couple of sessions in order to explain to you guys what it is that you need to fundamentally start off on your path and try to understand on how to crack these interviews. Now, first of all, let's understand that for these consulting profiles, some of the most important concepts that are tested in interviews are guesstimates and case studies, particularly. So, we are hosting two sessions, and this is one of two series. And here we'll be specifically focusing on guesstimates. All right, first of all, how to start off understanding what a guesstimate is and how to crack it, we need to know what it is that is expected of you while trying to solve an guesstimate. Like what it is that the interviewer expects from you to do while giving you a question. And once you know what it is that they want, you can concentrate on those key areas and improve so that you will be much better off in the interview or in the particular scenario. Now, what is a guesstimate? A guesstimate is essentially an estimation problem for a given specific case that will be given to you, whereby you guess certain variables by using suitable assumption and logical reasoning. So because all the variables will not be given to you, you'll have to make certain assumptions by yourself. So clearly, guesstimate, although is a very quantitative solution, the logical reasoning plays a very important part. Hence, we can have to assure that there is no one correct or wrong answer for a guesstimate. Your logical reasoning and your explanation to whatever steps you're doing can make or break the problem and the solution. Once you understand that. Now, what it is that in particular is being focused on while you are solving the guesstimate. Now, a guesstimate is a question and you are essentially expected to solve in 10 to 15 minutes. So your ability to be quick on your feet is tested very clearly. Because you have very limited time, you'll have to know what it is that you need to do and go about it quickly. And the most important, if not the only thing that matters in a guesstimate, is your approach and structure of your solution. And since you are estimating, even your quantitative skills matter. However, do keep in mind that the approach and structure of your solution is way more important compared to the accuracy and precision of your solution. So you are free to guess, to round off any number that you have. Say 55, you can round off to 60 or even say 100, so that your quantitative part of the solve becomes very easy and your solution is generated much more quickly. Now, what this does is, in the time constraint that you have, you rounding off numbers to the nearest digits that you're comfortable with will make your solution not only faster, but it'll appear as though you're very quickly doing in the mathematical perspective and you're very good at crunching numbers. Now, this will make it look like you're very good in your quantitative section and much better than you are. Now, that is one thing that you should keep in mind, because it's always better to show one aspect of yours better. So once you understand what it is that you need to do, you can keep in mind and perform with these qualities in mind and focus your solution primarily on these problems. So now that we understand what it is that you need to focus on, let's talk about how do you start off with the guesstimate. Now, what does a guesstimate officially look like? An example of a guesstimate question could be something like, estimate the number of pens in NIT Warangal, or estimate the number of bikes in NIT Warangal, or anything like that. Now, if the question is asked randomly to any of y'all, it seems like a very random question. You don't know how to go about it. But that is what a guesstimate is all about. You're estimating whatever is given, but to make your solution easier, you're going to guess a lot of variables, make a lot of assumptions, reason, and that is what the course of a guesstimate is all about. So I think from this only, all of you will understand that although it is an estimation, there is no correct answer because the question is very generalized and random, whereby it all that matters is how you start off and go about your solution as opposed to what you end up having an answer with in your head. So the solution is not just the matter, but the entire path that you take is very important. So let's talk about what it is that you need to start off with. So the first step that you need to do is confirm the objective of the case given to you. For example, let's assume a question something like the number of vehicles in a particular area. Now, what your doubt should be here is what vehicle are you considering? So it could be anything from a tricycle to a train. They're all considered vehicles. But when you start off estimating, even if you don't ask anything, you'll have to know what it is that you are looking at. So the first step is confirming what it is that you need to calculate in the first place. Because the last thing you want is go about starting the solution and going halfway through and then being told that all that you're doing is unnecessary because you can just ignore. So the first step for your problem would be to actually identify what it is that you're doing and confirm what is the objective. And for this, you should ask certain preliminary questions to your interviewers. Like in the scenario that I just told about vehicles, you can go ahead and ask the interviewer if you're considering cycles or bikes or cars. Now, if okay, most of the time the interviewer will tell you what is the vehicle that you want after you ask the question. Now, sometimes if the interviewer goes up and tells you saying you can choose what you want, then to make your life easier, since we're talking about NIT Warangal, it'll be easy to consider only bikes and cycles because you can ignore the number of cars or keep it to a minimal amount and ignore every other vehicle that you can think of. But you don't just ignore it right up. Okay. So the second step would be to think logic. Okay. I did say there's a time constraint and you need to be quick on your feet. But what that does not mean is that you start off with a solution and don't know how to go about it. So it's okay for you to take a minute or two before starting your solution. It's okay. The interviewer will give you time, or you will have enough time in the session to stop yourself, think to yourself, and come up with a possible set of approaches. Because there's more than one perspective to look at for a particular problem. And you need to try to look at the problem from different perspectives and understand what is the pros and cons of each of these approaches that you are thinking of. So the first step after getting the question correctly is to think of all the answers that you have and seeing which answer is better than what and why. So the third step is evaluating each approach and confirming with the interviewer if you can go ahead with it. Now, what we need to understand is a guesstimate isn't like a normal question in an exam whereby the question is given and you do what you want, you can end up getting a final answer and you give it. That's not how a guesstimate works. A guesstimate is more of an interviewer driven. It's more of a discussion between you and the interviewer or interviewers if it's in a panel. So you'll have to evaluate each approach and confirm, as in you have different sets of approaches in your head. What you do is explain each and every one of your approaches to the interviewer and tell him why you want to choose one particular approach over the other and ask if that is the correct way to go about it. Now, since it is a discussion, the interviewer will indirectly try to help you to go in the right approach. In different steps along the way, you will get help, but you'll have to ask for help. But the thing is, you'll get subtle help. The interviewer will not tell you you should go about this way only. That is not how it works in a guesstimate. You'll have to give him saying, I think there is plan A, there's plan B, there's plan C, and I want to go with plan A over the others because of so and so reason. And then you ask, is it okay? So once you do that, you will get positive, constructive feedback from the interviewer during the guesstimate. So there's a confirmation saying, yes, you can go ahead with this, please go. So now that your approach is finalized, the next step would be to state assumptions made beforehand. Now, since it is guesswork involved in the solution, so you'll have to make certain assumptions for the solution to start. Because, for example, in the question where we're talking about number of vehicles in NIT Warangal, your assumption would be the vehicle which you're taking in the first place, and how many people do you think are there in campus, or there are other assumptions which you'll have to make logically, because the question is very generalized and you need a starting point where you can look at from. So you need to state assumptions beforehand, because the last thing you need is start off with the problem and get stuck in an area and don't know how to proceed, all because it was something that you had to guess in the first place but you failed to assume it. Because assumptions may look like a very easy task, but in reality what matters is they can make or break your problem. Because an assumption is essentially what you're taking any number or any information that you find comfortable, but if that information is not there in the first place and you fail to assume it as well, then you don't have anything to go about your solution with. So assumptions are very important in a guesstimate. Like guess is like half the word, so assumptions is important. Now the critical part is, like I said, approach and structure. So you'll, in a guesstimate, you'll have to explain your thought process and structure clearly to the interviewer. Now there are two ways of going about this. Ideally there is the verbal way, whereby you go about explaining what it is that you're thinking and why you are doing so to the interviewer. Yes. Okay, so the first way of explaining yourself is the verbal way. Now, of course, everyone can do the verbal way, but there's another way of making it much better, which is visually representing what is on your thought process. Now, visually laying down a table or a hierarchy of events or subdivisions, segments. Now, doing that visually on a paper, it'll be much easier for the interviewer to understand as to what it is that you're trying to do or what it is you've done. So first step before quantitatively crunching numbers would be to lay down the structure, a rough structure at least, on paper, and then begin solving. What this does is, one, it helps you convey your thought process easily to the interviewer. And second of all, it defines your thought process, because as you go along solving the question, there may be many other alternatives that comes to your mind as you go about solving. Now, you may either choose to ignore it or you may go about taking this new path. But since you've already had a preliminary idea that you have in your head in the first couple of minutes, it's better to lay down the structure so that you limit yourself to what you thought initially was the right way to go and enhance it, as opposed to changing it altogether. So laying down a structure helps you in making your own thought process much clearer and helps you explain as well in a very clear manner. So that is about how to start. Now, as you go about each step, you should make logical assumptions wherever necessary, but you shouldn't just stop with making the assumption. But as I said, a guesstimate is a discussion between you and your interviewer, and it is as interviewer driven as it is driven by you, because you're getting feedback from the interviewer. So it's always appreciated if you can make assumptions and explain what it is that you're doing and why you are doing so, and confirm with the interviewer. Because during an interview or during a guesstimate, getting confirmation from the other side is always constructive, because now you know that this is the path that is accepted by the other side, and the answer may be correct, may not be correct, but you've gotten a confirmation that yes, this is the right way to go, and that makes you feel better and it helps in confidence as well. And when you are thinking about solving an issue, a very general issue where your thought process matters, every ounce of confidence is important. So confirming with the interviewer every step you take is a very critical move. And the next step would be always try to communicate with the interviewer. Like I always said, it's a discussion, so you'll have to make the interviewer understand in depth on what it is that's going on in your head and why you are doing what you are doing. Now, once both you and your interviewer panel are on the same loop, the guesstimate gets solved in a much easier fashion. And it's also, since it is understood by the interviewer, and since you are asking for feedback at every step, there is one of two ways. One is, wherever you are going to make a mistake, there will be feedback trying to guide you back into the track that you're expected to go on, because you are always trying to explain. The second one would be, since you are explaining your thought process very vividly to the interviewer, he understands what it is you're doing, it's much easier for him to understand your solution as well, as opposed to just seeing your assumptions and seeing your final answer. So the reasoning behind it is very, very crucial to make your case study or guesstimate strong. Now, once you follow the above steps, you will end up with a final answer as you go about. Now, if you have time and if you're very confident with your approach, your quantitative calculations and everything, and if you have time, it's optional, but it is always better to recalculate or provide an approximate ballpark with another approach. Say, for example, if you're doing the number of pizzas a person eats, now you can talk about how many pizzas a person can eat and the number of people who come to a place and get an answer. And you can also do another method whereby you see how many people go to the shop in the first place and how many pizzas do the shop sell or how many pizzas can the shop make. So you have two different approaches. So if you are very confident in one of the approaches, then only for the end choose the smaller approach and recalculate so that you can approximate and get an answer in both the methods and say, see, yes, this is the cross verification and see, I have gotten the same answer. So my guesstimate thought process has worked successfully. So this adds a level of confidence and it explains your solution much better. However, do this only if you're confident with your original method and you have time given to you in the guesstimate. These are the things you need to keep in mind. These are the basic steps you need to do for a guesstimate. All right. Now, like I said, you first start with a very general idea and you go each step. Like, for example, when we said the number of cycles in NIT Warangal, what we could mean, we can't just go about getting a final answer just from that, right? We need to know, for example, how many people are in campus and how many people are outside campus. Like who are day scholars and who are hosteliers. For example, hosteliers may have more cycles while day scholars may have more of bikes. So that's the reasoning which you'll follow. But when you go about solving, these may seem like very obvious thought processes, but when you are putting it as a structure, you'll need to address to all these issues. So that's the example where you, for example, you start off with hosteliers as one column and day scholars as another column. Now you've got what primarily they have. Now, even in hosteliers, there might be boys versus girls or people who stay near classes, people who don't stay near classes. There are different parts that you can divide the population sample space into. So division of your general sample space is very important in a guesstimate. Regardless of what your question is, there will be some sort of division or multiplication in guesstimates. So we'll look into all of that later, but let's talk about how do you first divide, because these are the basic fundamentals of a guesstimate, which is segmentation. Now, segmentation is what makes your structure in the first place, because structure is all about you dividing your sample space into different blocks. Now, how do you go about dividing blocks? These blocks or segments must be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Now, what does this mean? This means that the different segments you take should not overlap with each other, because essentially what you're doing in segmentation is dividing the sample space into different parts and estimating for each small part, which is relatively smaller than your original, and then adding up each value or whatever the answer you need from each small part collectively to form the big part that you've originally set out to calculate. So if the segments overlap with each other, then your calculation may not be very easy because they overlap, there'll be something in common as well. So that's not what you want. So the segments should be thought of very clearly and they should be exclusive and they should be exhaustive, as in the different segments that you take must cover the overall idea of the question. So like the example we're addressing here would be the number of cycles in NIT Warangal, and I said it's about day scholars and hosteliers. Now this is they don't overlap with each other. There might be some people who may stay outside in hotels, hostels, PGs, etc., but they don't have a hostel room inside, so it's not overlapping in any way. And also they're exhaustive because every student here might definitely be one of two categories. He might either stay outside or stay inside because he needs a place to stay near campus, right? So he has to be in one of these two categories regardless of who he is. So the two segments that we have taken in this category at least would be exhaustive as well. So this is an ideal form of segmentation, just a simple example. Now, some other examples of segmentation commonly used would be something like profit structure, client segmentation, and increasing sales. Now, these three examples in particular, we'll be looking at in the coming slides. Okay, let's talk about profit structure. Now, in this, the question might be something like estimate the profits derived from a particular product, or estimate the profits that a company will get in a particular place, or questions like that. It's essentially involving around the profits something generates. Now, what we need to understand is how do you calculate profits. Now, profits is the relationship between the revenues and costs, as in revenues is the cash inflow, cost is the cash outflow. So the difference between the two is what is retained by the company at the end of the given time frame, considered as profits. So revenues is what you get for your services, and cost is what you pay to establish those services in the first place. Now that is what we need to know. So we've segmented profits as revenues and costs, because those are the two parts that you need to calculate in order to get your profits. So now you've got your revenues and costs. Now these are still general categories if you seriously think about it. So you need to further segment this into different parts so as to calculate them with more confidence and estimate their values correctly. So costs can be further segmented as fixed costs and variable costs, and costs across value chain. But then the first primary step that you segment is fixed costs and variable costs. Costs across value chain for simple products is easier and it's very much preferred. But when the product gets complicated, it is better to first look at the time constraint and then go about doing so. Of course, this step is going to make your answer very much more accurate and precise, but the efficiency at which you do work is what matters in a guesstimate, considering the time constraint. So everything here can be indefinitely segmented if you think of logic. For example, let's talk about geographical segmentation in revenues. Now it says regional or country wise. So regional can be upper hemisphere, lower hemisphere for simplicity, or it could be country wise. But if you really think about it, in a country like India, it could be 26 different states, and each state could be divided into, say, districts. So when you go about segmenting, so your estimation becomes more precise, you end up with an unlimited number of segments. Now, this may be good if you have a huge indefinite time frame, but in a guesstimate, that is not, since you are making guesses and assumptions to reduce the time you're using, it is safe to say that you don't go to very high levels of precision. So always think about your time before doing so. Now, for revenues, your segmentation would be something like geographical data, as in, like I said, country wise, regional wise, or anything. And then you've got your different customer segments. Now, this can be in terms of income. The most commonly used segments in terms of this would be income, because when we're talking about profits and the revenue generated, we need to look at the number of people who will be potential customers, and this will primarily be based on income of the customer. So this is a very important segmentation method that you need to look at. And the other ones would be revenue streams. So if it's a service for that matter, you need to see what is the revenue generated in the form of ads and in the form of distribution deals or other things. And in terms of distribution, it can be how you do it, whether it's online distribution or retail distribution. So on and so forth. Now, if you start thinking about a very specific problem, the number of segments that you can think of will be unlimited. You can keep on segmenting each part as in how you go. For example, like we said here, ads and distribution. Distribution can be further divided into online and retail. Now, if you think about online, you can think of various different social media platforms and other streams that you use. So you can keep dividing it, but it's always better to limit yourself to a certain extent. It's okay if you have a couple extra minutes after your solution, you can always cross check your answer. So you don't have to always go about a very, very high level of accuracy and precision, because the structure and your confidence in the structure and the method that you're doing matters more than the solution that you get in the end itself. So this is about profit structures. Now, another example will be customer segmentation. Now, we did mention this briefly in the profits, but I'll try to explain this in detail. So when you talk about customer segmentation, your questions will be like, what is the size of the market? Or how many people will buy a certain product? Or like our usual example, how many bikes are there in NIT Warangal? So how many bikes are there in NIT Warangal can also be addressed to as how many people in NIT Warangal will buy bikes. Yes, it makes the same sense. So when you're looking at it in a different perspective, now you look at how many people in NIT Warangal will buy bikes. So when you look at that, you need to see the number of customer clients that you have in Warangal to buy the particular product. So when you look at that, this is just a general table in terms of any product for that matter. It doesn't have to be bikes in general. But here we have the customers that you get can be segmented as personal households, that is individual households, or professional background where this is institutions and organizations. Now these are the two segments, because see, people may buy for their office but they also buy for their home. So but you can keep what they buy in their home as a different criteria and what they buy in the office is a different criteria, so that way they don't overlap, because the person may be the same but the product that you are selling to that person is different in its own way, right? So you can keep it as two different segments. So when we look at institutions and organizations, it's better to just keep it as only one level of segmentation, that is public sector and private sector, because these questions will primarily have a lot of statistics involved, and the sample space will also be pretty big, and there'll be a lot of reasoning involved in such questions. So the professional side, that is the organization side, is limited to public sector and private sector. You just estimate certain segments for those two segments alone and keep that as one solution. Now when you come to households, your primary perspective would be in terms of income. For example, people who buy bikes, let's say people who can afford to buy bikes will buy bikes. People who won't afford to buy bikes, who can't afford, won't buy bikes. People who are in the middle category, who can afford but don't want to spend all that money, may share and buy. There's a small possibility of them buying, right? So it's a different part. Like you can say that in terms of income, their probability of buying that particular product is also varied. So you can explain it in such a way. So segmentation in itself is very important, but even the explanation should be brought through to the interviewer, saying why it is that there's income. For example, if you're dividing into low, medium, and high income, just explaining that would not matter. You'll have to explain what you think is low income, medium income, and high income, and why it is that you think that this income category will affect how they buy your product. So explaining this will give you extra brownie points, and it's always good for the interviewer to know that you have thought this through, because you can simply divide it and go about your statistical calculation, but guesstimates primarily think they are aimed to evaluate your thought process and clarity. So you always need to know what you're doing and why you are doing it, and just knowing is not enough, but you need to explain to the interviewer or panel that this is why I am doing. So it's very important. Just segmentation itself is very, very critical, but why you are doing it is also important. So you cannot stress enough on the importance of communication in a guesstimate, because it's interview driven, it's interviewee driven and interviewer driven. So you get positive feedback from the interviewer as well. It's not always do what you want to do. It is more about, yes, this looks like a good method, so go for it. So it's more of a constructive feedback that you get from the interviewer, and you don't really get a feedback if you don't give any capital or principle to begin with. So it's always about you giving information and asking for feedback, and feedback is very crucial because it helps you go about in your case study. Now not only does this additionally help you with your structure, but it also gives you the tinge of confidence that you need to go about your solution. Because if you go on to the second step but are still confused about the first step, although it is correct, your solution will take a hit, and that is not what you want when you are trying to solve a guesstimate. So that's about customer segmentation. Now when you talk about increasing sales, this is a very general criteria. Now how can you increase sales of a company? You either increase the number of customers or you try to aim at what each customer buys. So these are the two things that a company can specifically aim at. So when you look at this, you go about seeing as to how you can go about each of the problems. And if you do, what is the result? So there are different segments, like we've given in this table, where increasing the number of customers would involve going new segments in the same market or entering new markets. Now, if you're entering new markets, you need to explain on what do you think is the new market that the specific company needs to enter into. Or if we're talking about new segments, for example, we're talking about Tata or any car company for that matter, or a phone company, then it's still a phone market, but it's about which segment of the market are you aiming at. For example, an iPhone used to be at a very premium price point, but then they decided to go about a new segment in the same phone brand where they try to aim it with a little lower price product, right? Although they didn't compromise on the quality, but they did try to go about in a new segment. So when you're looking at this, you need to understand that you need to explain what it is that you think they will do and what happens. So you'll have to explain that and then try to estimate. Similarly, for every segment, you'll have to explain what is the basis of your segmentation and how does it help. And after that, you go about segmenting and calculating each part. So that's the basics of segmentation. Now, yeah, so I did say earlier that you can go about segmenting indefinitely if you really think about it, but a guesstimate is always coming along the time constraint. So you do have to choose certain segments over other segments. For example, if you're selling football for that matter, it's a question like if you sell the amount of football that you're selling, now you'll have to see first think about the age groups that you're aiming at. So people from the age of 8 say to 30 are your customer base, and people over 30 will definitely buy footballs. I mean, they can buy, but the point is the volume of trade that you get from those set of people is comparatively less compared to your age group of 7 to 30 or 8 to 30. It's assumption, of course, so you can guess your numbers. So what you can do is keep the other sections for last, that is the above 30 age group for last. Or what you could do even better is pick 30 to 45 as one age group, 45 above or 60 above as another age group. Choose to ignore one of the segments and keep the other segment with a very small volume and keep it for later, but start off with your primary segment. Because for example, if your estimated final answer is something around 5 million, and your age group of 7 to 30 is essentially giving you something like 4 million out of that 5 million, it's always better to estimate that specific age group first. So it's always better to start off with the bigger issues first and put more effort and logical reasoning and explanation into those segments as opposed to other segments, because it's relatively smaller in size compared to your original space, but they give a lot of impact to your solution. Like I said, the 4 out of 5 million is given from a smaller sample space. So it's better to go about solving the more effective ones first and then start off with the other ones. Now, what this does is you are prioritizing one over the other, and this gives the interviewer a sense of how good you are at management of your resources. And it may be an additional quality, but in an interview it's always better to show off all your qualities as opposed to showing off just a specific quality. Like wherever you get the chance, it's better, right? So this makes your job easier and it also gives you an added benefit. So it's always preferred to prioritize certain segments over others to save time, and even your crunching numbers becomes easy. For example, you spend 10 or 15 minutes in one segment and you have one more segment left which is less important. What you could do is just give a random assumption. Don't bother going into very deep explanation. Just give a random assumption, get a value which is in a much quicker fashion, add it up, and end your guesstimate when your time is up. So you've done most of your work in one of the segments which you thought was more important, and that is giving you more impact on your final answer as opposed to the other one which you've done half-heartedly or a very quick manner. So even though you've done it in a very quick manner, your solution doesn't take that much of a hit compared to what it would have happened if you did both of the segments in a faster, less in-depth manner, right? So it's better to prioritize one over the other, but keep in mind that you need to complete everything regardless. It's not just doing one segment and leaving everything. That's not how a guesstimate works. you need to segment it correctly such that you know you will be able to complete everything. And what prioritizing means doesn't mean you ignore everything. It means you give more time for some over others. That's what prioritizing means. Now that we've talked about how to go about a question, how do you segment? Now, the age old question that most of you are probably wondering from the start is, how do you approach, like actually approach a problem? Because I have been saying, go about your approach, do steps, do one step, do segmentation. Now, what many of you are probably thinking is, what is the approach that you really need for a guesstimate? Like, that is the most important part, right? You need to know how do you go about things, because just telling do this do that is not going to do anything if I don't tell you the full picture, right? So full picture comes down to approaches, and it comes down to two approaches primarily. There might be many more, but the most important ones are only the two of them. So there's a top down approach and there's a bottom up approach. These are the two. Now we look into them a little in detail. I'll be giving you a basic idea of the two of them. Hopefully you understand how it works. Okay, let's start off with top-down approach. Now, top-down approach means you take the entire sample space as the start of your question, and you keep dividing it into smaller and smaller segments until you get to segments which you think is enough to explain the answer and easy to estimate. Like in this figure that we see, you divide it into 5 segments, and the end of your guesstimate would be you add up the estimation of each of those 5 segments, which collectively give you the value of your original segment, original sample space. Now that's what a top down approach means. You keep dividing from the top of the pyramid until you get to the base, add up every value that you get at the base so that they essentially give you the net total of what happens at the apex. That's what a top down approach means. And in top down approach is segmentation, that you're dividing the sample space into different parts. So this can be done in terms of demographics like age, income, and etc. But in a guesstimate, primarily most of the time it's just age and income that are involved. And geography. Now, geography can be urban or rural areas, or it can be different countries or different market spaces. So all this matters. Now, most important, if you have to choose between urban, rural, or different countries, is always preferred to choose urban or rural, because if you can see from this, now age groups, now let's say you have 4 age segments, and income 3 income segments. Now that gives you 4 into 3, 12 segments as it is. Now if you talk about geography, that is 2 already, urban, rural. So when you divide 12 into 2, that becomes 24. So when you keep dividing, you see that even from just 3 of these segmentation principles, you get a lot of different segments to calculate from. And when you have a time frame of 10 to 15 minutes, I think it's safer to say that all of us want lesser number of segments so that we don't have to really sit and add everything at the end of it. So it's better to limit your segmentation, but also keep in mind that the logical reasoning behind it is what matters more than the actual statistics. For example, if you're taking age, you need to explain why is age a parameter. Like the earlier example that we took, like footballs, you need to explain as to why the age group matters. Like people, like children play football more and they're interested more, so they buy football. So they're more of your customers than people who are above 30 who go to job and who don't have as much fitness. So generally speaking, they won't buy comparatively as much as the children. So you'll have to explain why age is a parameter when you're segmenting. Now you can go about it in a very vivid manner, or you could make sure that the interviewer understands what you're thinking. Just tell him saying age matters because children play more. So it's much shorter version, but you get your point across. So in terms of time, try to explain in the shortest way possible, but it should be in a very clear way that you've explained every perspective of your thought process. So that is the top-down approach. And examples would include, like I said, bikes in NIT Warangal, or number of products sold in a certain place, or number of cars running in a certain place, or examples like that. Those are your top-down approaches. Now, and this is the most easier commonly used approach among the two of them, because top down approach is all about dividing, right? So you just keep dividing and it becomes a smaller value, and hence you add 5 smaller values instead of getting one huge complex sample space. So adding is always easier, and dividing is also easier in terms of estimating. So top down approach is easier than bottom up approach, but it is less precise. There's less reasoning involved in a top down approach. I mean, it might be, say, 70% reasoning and 30% statistics. And that is actually more of statistics in comparison. We'll get to that later. So that's a top down approach. And now we're talking about bottom up approach. Now, what does bottom up approach mean? It means you take the smallest of blocks that you can think of and estimate for that block. Now what you do, you somehow scale up that estimation of that one block so that you get a bigger segment. And then once you get that segment, you scale that up with efficient logic to another bigger segment and keep doing so until you get to your main sample space. So an easier way of saying this would be a question like estimate the revenue generated in, say, a supermarket or a mall. Okay, if you take a supermarket, there are different sections in a supermarket, correct? So you can estimate the revenue given in, say, the vegetable section or the fruit section or the dairy section or anything like that. If it's a mall, it is divided into different shops, which are blocks. Literally speaking, they're blocks. So you estimate the revenue per store or per block, estimate it, and then you scale it up to the entire store. For example, you can say there are there are two types of stores, one that sells in huge volumes and gives you more revenue, while the other gives you comparatively lesser revenue. So you'll have an efficient multiplier so that you scale up the small block for one store that you have taken as revenue and scale that up to consider the whole supermarket or the whole mall. Now, of course, these questions can all this requires a lot of logical reasoning compared to top down approach. For example, in terms of quality, I'd say this would involve 85 to 90% of logical reasoning and 10% of statistics, since you'll have to explain why it is that that scalar factor is what you are taking and why it can't be anything else. For example, you could simply take saying one store out of 100 stores in the mall gives you, say, 100 rupees a day, then just multiply it into 100 and say the entire mall gives you only 10,000 rupees a day or something like that. But that is not necessarily true because there's a lot of logic involved. So multiplying the statistics part of this question is comparatively easy. But what matters more when you're taking a bottom up approach is you'll have to efficiently explain, take all the time that you have to explain the reason on why it is that that is how you're scaling up. Because scaling up in itself isn't that big a deal, but why you are doing what you're doing comes in more important in a bottom up approach than a top down approach. Because when you're approaching it in a table, looking at the structure, you can understand from a top down approach on what it is that you've done. But when you're talking about scaling up, it's harder to represent visually as compared to the other approach. So you'll have to verbally take your time and explain in detail what it is that you're doing. Now, although this approach gives you more accurate results compared to the other, you need to put in a lot of effort and thought process into scaling up in the first place. So that is why this is the least preferred approach. Because if you start solving over time, you think about what it is that you've thought of, you'll see that most of the time you end up preferring the top down approach instead of the bottom up approach in many cases. Sometimes you may even reciprocate, like even for the revenue per mall, you may even go about making a mistake choosing the other approach by going about saying how many people come to a mall and how much they buy. So that is the top down approach for the exact same problem. But although you may think that is the way to go, in certain problems bottom up approach is much easier, but the reasoning needs to be made very clearly. So that's the only difference between the two approaches, and why one approach is over the other in certain scenarios. Okay, now let's just recap on what we have done. So first, you need to ask preliminary questions and figure out what it is that you need to do and start thinking about it. So first, you take some time before starting off your solution. Take some time to yourself and think about various approaches and various perspectives to that problem. Because even even if the interviewer does suggest you an alternative approach that you didn't think of, first of all, you might have thought of a structure and solution that you are going to take this solution upon. And if the interviewer suggests something else to you, you have one of two ways. One, you take him up on it and start solving his method, or two would be trying to explain on why your method is better than his method, and then go about your method, which is what you would want to do primarily because you've already thought about it. And taking up a new method without thinking is the last thing you want to do during solving a solution, because as it is the general solution which you don't know anything about, and you really don't want to take a step that you don't know anything about either. So think about all the approaches before starting off a new solution, and so that you need to compare every approach that you can think of and come up with some sort of reasoning in the off chance that the interviewer asks you why it is that you've taken what you've done, or if he suggests an alternative approach, you need to be able to explain your perspective as well. So that really matters, and thinking and having a basic idea helps a ton. And the second one, as I've already said, is use diagrams and a clear structure to explain your thoughts clearly. And then we have already recapped that you have to always justify and explain your assumptions, and explain them with logic, real life examples, and other things. Okay, so the logic that you're using to make your assumptions should be very sellable, and that it shouldn't be very off that the interviewer doesn't accept it. So like we say, 25-year-olds don't buy football because they go to work. That is not necessarily true. He could say, saying you are just starting to work, you will have enough time to go play. But when you're talking about 60-year-olds who don't play, you have a sellable logic saying he's not interested in playing anymore, or relatively he won't play that much. So you have something of a logic that you can base your assumption on. So that you always need to keep in mind. And a guesstimate, like I said, is a discussion between you and your interviewer and solving the certain scenario. So you need to always engage the interviewer and keep him in the loop as to what your thought process is and what it is that you're doing over the course of the solution. Because the interviewer, as much as the interviewer understands what you're doing, the more the chance that your solution is regarded as the correct one. Because a guesstimate in reality doesn't really have a correct answer and a wrong answer. Like your answer may be 70 also, it may be 100 also, but that doesn't mean 100 or 70 is the more correct option. What matters is whether the person you are telling to has understood what you have done, and then what does he think is the right one, and if he thinks you're correct enough, then your solution is considered correct. So it doesn't really matter on what you do as long as you make it clear on what you have done. So that's more important. Now, what you shouldn't do, because it's still a guesstimate, right? So you have to do the guesswork on your own. So when we talk about preliminary questions, you don't ask too many preliminary questions. Like it's still a guesstimate, right? It's a guesstimate. So you'll still have to guess something and not always probe for too many details, because at that point the interviewer thinks you can't really assume anything on your own and you don't really understand the question properly, and you're just trying to get the answer from him indirectly. But the problem is you shouldn't go too deep, and you have to stop at a level where you have enough details but you don't have all the details, because it's better to not have all the details, because now you have flexibility to think. You can ignore what you want, you can take what you want, because you just have to explain why you're doing what you're doing instead of them telling you no, you have to take this. Meaning if you don't know what to do in it, and if the interviewer tells you you have to take it, then you asking too many clarifying questions will backfire, because now you have another segment to consider, which is not good. So try not to ask too many probing questions. And another thing is, like we said, you have to think of all the approaches, explain the approaches to him, and tell the interviewer what you are taking and confirm with him. Don't ask the interviewer what is the approach I should take, because end of the day, it's still you being tested. So a solution being given to you and you going about it is not the right way to do. So asking for the approach itself is a very bad move, and not only will it backfire, it's almost like a rejection, because you are telling the panel that you don't know what to do and you're asking them what to do. So that is not how you want to proceed in a guesstimate. So you tell them a couple approaches, like there might be 5 approaches you've thought of, but you just tell 2 or 3 and explain your most comfortable one as the approach that you want to take, and ask if that is okay. So that means you are not giving too much of an idea to the interviewer that you don't know the other two approaches. Of course, see, you may know how to solve it in all the three approaches, but what matters is you may not know also, but you'll have to choose the one you are most comfortable with without telling the panel that you don't know the approach. So it's always better to not ask them what approach to take. Now, this cannot be stressed enough. Start solving without letting them know what is on your mind. You will have to let them, even if you don't solve, explaining your thought process and structure on what you think should be done is productive enough than solving the entire question absolutely correctly without letting the interviewer know what you've done. Because just seeing a final answer in a guesstimate makes no sense. So, uh, it's always better to explain to the interviewer before solving, or solve and explain at the same time. Because even if your answer is correct, the value of your answer diminishes if you haven't explained your perspective correctly to the interviewer. And last but not the least, start with the population set every single time. Like I already stated, there might be questions where another approach may be much easier, but since you think the population set and segmenting the huge population set every single time and keeps making it smaller and trying to find demand, so that kind of perspective may seem very easy for you, but make sure that you know what the other approaches as well, because when you get a problem, you need to know what is the approach that is easier for you. Because if you know only the population set approach every time because you've done it for every question that you've thought of, and if you're going to use that all the time to solve, then there are certain questions which are making your life infinitely harder in the middle of the question, because you get to a point where you can't make any assumptions with logic, and you don't really know what to do because there's a supply side and a demand side. So if you're talking about supply side and you start calculating with the population set, that means you're talking about the customers but not talking about what you can give. For example, if you're talking about the number of sandwiches Amul gives, and if you're calculating the number of sandwiches he can make in the given time frame, so if you start with a population set and you come up with a demand of say 5,000 sandwiches an hour, that is possible considering the huge volume of students we have in campus. But when you start with the population set and come up with a number of 5,000 sandwiches an hour, but in reality, the Amul person cannot make 5,000 sandwiches in an hour. So in that case, it's better to look at how many he can make in the hour and say that, see, this is how many he can make and that is how much he'll sell, because he cannot sell what he doesn't make, right? So it makes no logical sense to use a population set in that case. It may seem right, you can logically explain what you've done over the course of time, but when you look at fundamentally what the question says and what your answer is, the problem is exactly that. Starting with the population set can be explained in most scenarios, but you can explain it as well. Now every step along the way, see, you can explain saying these are boys, these are girls, and boys eat this much, girls eat this much. All of them make absolute sense. You can always say boys, both certain people play so they'll eat more, certain people stay in their room, they don't eat. So you can explain a lot of things, you can keep segmenting, you can come up with solution. But if you come up with an answer of 5,000 sandwiches an hour, it really doesn't make sense, right? So you'll have to look at which approach makes more sense in a guesstimate case specifically, and this you will get only as you explore different types of problems and think of it. Like, you don't have to sit and solve, you just have to think of what you would do if you got that question, and if it makes sense at the end of it. So you'll have to think a guesstimate is more of a mind psychological thinking concept as opposed to a statistically solving question. So even though the word estimate is there, it's still more of guesswork. It's a 50-50, but guesswork is more involved than the estimate, because you are not statistically solving much in any way, because you're going to round it off and then make an approximate assumption. So when you use the words like assumption, guesswork, your precision and accuracy is essentially diminishing as you go. So what matters more is your logical reasoning and whether your fundamental thinking of the problem is correct. So that is most important while approaching a guesstimate. Okay. Now that we've Okay, so now we've just gone on and on about the theory of guesstimates, what guesstimates are, and what you should do, and other things. So now all this theory isn't going to amount for much if you don't know how to use it in a real question. So let's look at a question where we see what to do and how to apply all this theory that we're doing and to see how the solution comes. All right. So let's talk about this. So we'll take an example. The question would be, say, estimate the number of schools in a city. It's a very general question. It could be any city. So it could be Hyderabad. It could be, say, Chennai, Mumbai, Kolkata, any city. Like, depending on the interviewer, you can choose what you want. But in this case, let's be even more specific and say city. I mean, very general, say city. Now, estimate the number of schools in a city is very general. Like, you give it to me, and I probably wouldn't know where to start if I haven't seen a guesstimate or the concept of guesstimate in my life. So you ask anyone, what is the number of cities in a school? It'll be a very random, real life assumption, and it's a very no logic guesswork as opposed to a guesstimate, right? You need to explain why do you think that is the case. So let's talk about this question in particular. Now, okay, so now how do we go about seeing the number of schools in the city? One, we can just count the number of buildings. Okay, so we could do in this particular area this many cities are there, so you just scale it up. Or a better way would be to see the number of people going to school and how many people can one school hold. So if you have these two, the number of schools in the city can be given as school going children in the city divided by the average number of students per school. Yeah, does that make sense? So when you get that, now this is the formula that you take into account. This is your approach. Now, of course, I did state a couple other approaches as well, but when you are doing this in the actual guesstimate, you'll have to think about why this particular formula based approach is better than scaling up. So we can see that the number of school going children and the number of students is primarily what the school, because schools are built in a city based on the school going people in the city, right? If you are in a Sahara desert or some desert where there is no children or there is no student, there's no one living, it's uninhabited, so there isn't going to be a school built there because there's no one going to go to that school, right? So it's better to base the number of schools based on the number of school going children in the city. So that's one. And the average school, I mean, average students per school is what determines how many schools you need for that number of children. So this would probably be the explanation on why you are going to take this approach. Okay. So once that happens, the two variables that you're going to have to estimate would be school going children and average number of students per school. Now, school going children is your standard population set question. We'll solve it in the coming slides, but school going children would be your normal segmentation question, whereby you start with the total number of people in the city and you go about dividing the sample space until the point where you see the number of people going to school. So that is what you need to do. Now the other variable would be the average number of students per school. Now what do you do about this? A basic idea for this would be assume different types of schools and guess their capacities. What does this mean? This means we are scaling up from one school to the total number of schools. So every school is not equally sized, right? So when you're talking about estimation of something and you're trying to relate it to real life, you will always have to have different types of a certain thing like a school. So you'll have to keep large, medium, small schools and try to guess their capacity in terms of volume of students, because it's end of the day it's still an estimate. So you need to have quantitative data, not just qualitative. So you need to guess their capacities. Now, how do you do that? We'll come about that in the coming slides. So this is your basic method on how to go about this problem. Okay. Now let's start off with the number of school going children in the city. So in our city, let's assume there are 20 million people. It might be different depending on the city, but in this general city that we're considering, it has 20 million people population. So now we first divide it into age groups. Now, why are we taking age groups first and not any other? That's because we're talking about school going children, right? Now, of course, there might be 50-year-olds attending school because of, well, I don't know what their background is, but it is possible, right? There is no age limit for education, but it's a standard assumption that going to school and which grade you are in is somewhat dependent on how old you are. Like, for example, 20-year-olds go to college. They may be even in school, but generally they're considered to be in college. So things like that. So we're going to see the first level of segmentation will be based on your age. So here we take different age groups. First, we take 1 to 3 years old. The other segment will be 4 to 10 years old. Then there'll be 11 to 16 years old. Then 17, 18, and then 18 plus. Now, what is the basis of the segmentation? Because that's what matters, right? So 1 to 3 nursery. Now, nurseries aren't exactly schools that we're considering. Now, there are different nursery homes. Then many of the okay, like a large proportion of kids don't really go to nursery, or even if they go, it's a specific nursery as such, and it isn't part of a school. So in our case, to make it easier for us to calculate, we're going to keep that as one segment and keep that for last. Now the other segment would be ages 4 to 10, which accounts for junior KG to 5th grade of students. Okay, so this would involve the initial education that a kid gets. Okay, so this is something that is very important for a kid, because many people think just initial education is sufficient enough. If that is the last thing they want to do, that is what they will do. So initial education till 5th grade is one part, which is primary school. And then the next segment would be middle school, something like 11 years old to 16, which is 6th grade to 10th grade. Now this would be your middle school. And the other segment would be ages 17 to 18, which is your higher secondary or 11th, 12th. Now, this may be junior college, intermediate, higher secondary, goes by different names, but we keep that as a different segment. And there's another segment, which is everyone who passed out or who's out of school. So, obviously, in this 18 plus category, there may be someone who comes to school, but it's a very rare occurrence, or it's not a generalized occurrence. So, we keep them out of school. We don't consider. And then we assume values for each of these segments. Now, the values that you take, which is 1.2 million, 2.8 million, 2.4 million, 0.8 million, and 12.8 million. Now, all these values are assumed values or percentages of the original 20 million. Now, why you're taking this percentage, you don't really have to explain, but you just have to specify what the percentages are, because you've already explained why you are segmenting it as this many segments and why are the segments there. Once you've done that, you can assume the size of the segment as anything, not anything, but it needs to be somewhat relevant. But you don't have to go into detail on why 4 to 10 age group is 2.8 million particular. But it's always better to explain why 4 to 10 is a thing and why it can't be 4 to 18. So you'll have to explain why primary school is what matters. Okay, so you assume values for each of these segments. Now that's your first level of segmentation done. But from this, you really can't come up with a final answer, because everyone in the city who's aged from 4 to 10 may not go to school, right? So there might be another segment that you need to look at. There might have to be more detail for you to come up with an estimation. So we look at another level of segmentation, which is income segment, which is this box over here. Now in our category, we're going to take three segments, which is one is middle class, there's another category which is lower middle class, and there's another category which is below poverty line. Okay, so these are going to be the three different income segments that we take in this scenario. Now middle class people generally send their children to school throughout, because they think education is what matters, and since they can afford it, they send their children to school throughout. So we keep it as 100% for all three categories. Middle class, of course, it may not be true for all cases, but we are guessing, and you have a possible reasoning on why they might send all their children to school. So once you explain that, it's over. It's 100% for each of them. And now you get to, and they account for 40% of the population. And then the next segment will be lower middle class, and they also account for 40%. But they're not as financially strong as a middle class to prioritize education over their other needs. Like there may be other needs like rent or food or anything of that sort, which may stop them from sending all of their children to school. They may send children, of course, they may send to school. It's not that they won't, but they won't send each and every child that is born in a lower middle class family to school. That's the base. Of course, this can be different, but in our case, we'll assume this. So now we talk about for initial primary education, we talk all the boys and 80% of the girls in lower middle class family are sent to school for primary school. So we're taking a 50% segment of male and female. So that you just average it out and that becomes 90% of the population goes for one sec. Yeah, so 90% of population goes for primary school. Now you talk about middle school. Again, you take the same 100% boys, 80% girls, which gives you a 90% for middle school. Now the higher secondary is where it gets lower because we've seen even in daily life, many people drop out in 10th and some people drop out in 5th. It's a very rare case, but many people drop out in 10th. They don't really finish all the way till 11th and 12th. So there are people who go, but not everyone goes for 11th and 12th. Some people drop out for 10th, do diploma, or go for work because of family needs, or they may have a different approach to life, of course. But we're talking about lower middle class family takes half of the boys and a quarter of the girls because it's half again. So a quarter of the girls to higher secondary. So that's an average of 37.5% of the population going for 12th grade, 11th, 12th grade. Now that comes. Now you talk about below poverty line category, which is 20% of the population in this city. Of course, the 40-40-20 split can be anything for that matter, depending on your city. So if you're talking about a rural area, it may be different. If you're talking about an urban area, it may be different. If you're talking about any city, you can take a different value. Of course, all this is just guesswork, right? You just have a little bit of reasoning and you're set. So when we're talking about below poverty line, we see half the boys and half the girls go for primary school. Because note that below poverty line, even primary school is less than the primary school of lower middle class. And it's almost half. That's because you have to consider their financial stability as well, right? So half of them go for okay, half of them go for this. Now you talk about 25% of the population goes for middle school. So that's that. And then higher secondary isn't really very, very important. So note that we put 0. Of course, you can put a lesser number, but it's all subjective to the person solving it and the interviewer, of course. So that's that. And once you do, you have the added up numbers, right? Now you've got school going children. Now the second part of the solution will be then you've got the types of schools. Now we already told large, medium, and small. So the percentages we can assume here would be 30, 50, and 20. So 30, 50, and 20 would be the size, the occurrence of the schools that you've taken. Now to calculate each capacity, we take large schools, which means they are large. So they'll have all the classes that you're looking into. So we take from junior KG to 12th all the way through, which is 14 classes. And then you've got 5 divisions per class, per standard. So there may be A, B, C, D, E, or any subdivision for that matter. This way. So for a large school, we'll have 5 divisions and 40 students per class. So when we have that, this is the assumptions we take for a large school. Of course, you can take any different number, but we'll keep this number for now for simplicity. So it becomes 2,800 students in a large school. Now you talk about a medium school. So medium school is a relatively smaller one. So it doesn't have it all the way through. So it has till 10th grade. So it has junior KG to 10th grade. And since it's not the biggest of schools, it has 3 divisions per class, per standard. And then it has slightly bigger population per class because it has to fit more people. So 50 students, because anything more, they probably don't have attention. So it's 50 students. So once you have, it can be a different number, but let's keep this here. So that gives you 1,800 students for a medium school. And now for small schools will be like they just address to primary education, at least in our case. So that's just junior KG, the first age group. And then you've got 2 divisions per class because it's not the biggest of buildings. They're very small. So 2 divisions and 30 students each because the rooms are small too. Like it's our assumption. So you can keep that there. So that will give you 300 students per school. So now you've got the size of each and every school, but then we need the average number of students, right? So what will your final approach be after all this guesswork? The final approach would be for each school, any school taken at random, your probability would be given as 30, which is 0.3, 50, which is 0.5, and 20%, which is 0.2, multiplied by the size of their respective schools. Okay, so you take the weightage given to each school and what is the size of each school, multiply, will give you the average students per school. Now that you've got that, now you see the total number of students. Now, total number of students are nothing but the final values you get from the school going children, which you've solved in the first part. So you've done that too. Now you get these two values. So this is the end of your guesswork and estimation, but almost. But then you did say the approach, the basic formula is to find the number of schools, right? Which is the division, which is the total students by students in each school. So you divide, you end up getting an answer of 2600. Now, note that this 2600 may be correct, may not be correct for each city, depending on how you do. But what matters in terms of the question would be the structure, as in what it is that you have done throughout and how you ended up with that 2600 schools. Now, it may be the absolute correct answer, but if you fail to explain what you've done and you just give the final answer of 2600, it holds no value. So that's what matters. So that's how you solve a question. All right. And well, if I did say you have to look into more questions and other things. So the resources for that would be, there are many YouTube channels. Some of them in particular are Case Interviews Cracked or the Consulting and Strategy Club of IIM Lucknow. These are some YouTube channels that give you solved examples and explain to you what the procedure are and how to go about solving specific guesstimate case studies or other things. So this would give you a basic idea and would even help you in certain difficult parts if at all you encounter them. And other resources would be question banks that you'd get specifically for guesstimates, and that would be shared soon. All right. Since I'm hoping all of you have listened to all of this, do you guys have any doubts? Please message them.
Guys, you can ask your doubts in the chat box, and don't worry about the recording. The recording will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, so you guys can follow our YouTube channel, and then mostly after the next session we will provide the recordings.
All right. Why is upper class not included here? Okay, I'm assuming we talk about the case study that we solved over here. So in this, we're talking about lower middle class, below poverty line, and middle class, right? What does this middle class mean? It includes the upper class as well. But here, our income segment is primarily focusing on whether they will send their children to school. It is not because anyone who thinks it is worth the money will send their children for education. At least that's our assumption here. So anyone above the middle class segment is paying for their children to go to school throughout. And I'm guessing this includes the upper class as well. Because lower middle class is where they have financial problems. And middle class includes people who don't have financial problems to send to school. So if middle class themselves don't have, I'm assuming that means upper class as well will be able to do so. So we included them in this middle class as well. So it's just the naming, but it includes the upper class as well. Um, did I get that clear? Guys,
Abhilash,
do you have any doubts?
hope hope your doubt got clear. So means if you guys can give us the feedback in the chat box, means how you like the session and all.
Yeah, so for further update of our events, there's the link to our Facebook and LinkedIn pages that you can follow, and we'd keep you posted there on what events are next. There's going to be another event on case studies as well, and yeah, you'll be updated about the timings in the pages. For practice questions, we'd be sharing some resources soon, which will have practice questions and solved examples as well. So you'd be able to uh, practice those questions on your own and see what happens.
Guesstimates, you guys practice, the more good you guys get at it. So our advice would be practice a lot with your friends. Uh, me and Sudarshan used to, like before interview session season, we used to solve around 2-3 guesstimates every day. So that's how we got good at it. So that is one suggestion from us. The more guesstimates you guys solve, the more angles you look at, whatever the guesstimate may be. You get it. You guys can make up your own guesstimates and solve it. That's it.
Okay. Okay, so Praveen, difference between interviewer driven and interviewee driven. Okay, so throughout the interview, throughout the session, I was telling something like you explain your thought process to the interviewer and ask for feedback, right? So what does this mean is that the interviewer will be giving you feedback on what you should do to proceed. Like you ask him, you have two plans and what you want to do, right? So the interviewer will tell you which one to do. So in other words, the interviewer drives on where the conversation goes and how you go about solving it. That's what interviewer driven means. Now what interviewee driven means is that you decide, like you just keep linking other topics together so that you come to a point where you want it. You are where you are, right? But you need to get to the point where you want to be. So what interviewee driven cases means is you do it on your own and somehow get the method and approach to the point where you are very comfortable. So that's the difference between the two of them. And an ideal guesstimate is always a combination of the two of them, and it's up to you on whether you want to use it more upon yourself or try to depend on the interviewer more. But a little level of dependence is needed, but it's up to you to be honest on what is that level of thing. Yes. No. See, when I said don'ts, I said you give two options and justify which option you want to do and confirm with the interviewer on whether that is correct, right? So if it is not correct, what do you think the interviewer would say? Do you get what I mean? You don't ask him, sir, what should I do? That is not what you do. You ask him, sir, I want to do this or that, but I think I should do this. Is it correct? So that's more about you not asking him how to go about it, but rather you ask him if you are going correctly. Now, know that there's a difference in the storyline here, right? You are not asking him what to do, but you're asking him what you're doing is correct. So, because of that, you are getting feedback, but you are not asking him for the very base of the question in itself. So, that's what matters. And the thin line between the two of them is what you need to be very careful not to cross. I hope I cleared your doubts. And how do you verify the answer we got is correct? Okay, so there's a way which, if you don't have time, you just go through the method that you've already done and see if logically, if the assumptions you've taken in each step make sense. So if you have made sense, then in a way that means that you can confidently say that your answer also makes sense. So that is one way if you're out of time. Now, another way would be there are two ways to a problem. There's either a supply side of it or there's a demand side of it. Like in that Amul example where I said, you talk about demand side, you may get 5,000. But then when you cross verify with the supply side to verify, you will not get 5,000 as the answer, right? So that's a way of cross verifying the answers that you get, and you'll have to make sure that the answers approximately line up together. And if they don't, then you'll have to go about and change the original assumptions that you've made as well. So it's better to verify, but the first step to that would be to make sure that the method you've done is correct, so that you can confidently go for the cross verification part and not just get a different answer altogether in both the approaches and then look clueless in front of the interviewer. That is not what we want. See, the cross verification is meant to strengthen our guesstimate solution. It's not going to make it worse. So even if you have to, make sure your cross verification is manipulated in such a way that it comes to an answer somewhat close to your actual answer. So that even if it doesn't really make sense, the cross verification part will give you the answer that you want, right? So it gives you an added benefit even though it is not completely correct. Now, of course, you don't have to do the manipulation in most cases, but sometimes that would have to be done. So the cross verification part is an optional step, and do that only if you're very, very confident in your work before that. Yeah. I hope I cleared your doubts. Any more doubts?
So my friend got this question in his in his interviews. The guesstimate was estimate the number of Domino's stores that are available in a given city. So there are two approaches to this. So one is taking the population set and doing it, and another approach is taking the area and doing it. So you should ask the interviewer, sir, I have these two approaches to do. So once you ask him, this shows him that you are thinking from multiple angles. So that is a brownie point for you. And then this also, this is what the interviewer driven case is all about. Guesstimates are usually interviewer driven. So he'll be like, okay, this guy is thinking from multiple angles, and he feels that if you go by the population set, the answer will be better. So he might tell, I prefer going in this way. So that's how you should converse and take your interview guesstimate sessions.
Yeah, so has this been made very clear? So none of you have any doubts? If you have, please do feel free to ask them in the chat box.
I think no one has any doubt. Shall we close the meeting?
Yeah, I guess.
Will there be practice? Yes, we'll be CCPD will be conducting, and we'll be also helping in conducting an interview.
Yeah, so
So thank you guys. I hope you had a good session. Continue learning. All the best for your placement seasons. See you on the next session on 7th. Thank you.
Thanks for the session. Thank you so much.